go take a biplane ride?
We're passing on our love of the sky and flying. Really, that's what we're doing. Bought the place in 1961, 62, and at that time this was considered to be very rural, and most of the people who lived in Edgartown and club members and whatnot, they thought this was a heck of a place to live. You should really live in town, you know. My wife's father owned the property, and he was loath to give it to me, so we looked up the going price out here, and I paid it the going price. That was the deal.
So it just happened to be close to the airport.
Well, I noticed it, let's put it that way. I started flying in 1944, and
who taught you?
I was in the Navy at the time, and whenever I was on leave and whatnot, I'd go to the airport, see, to get ahead of things, try to learn to fly before the Navy was teaching me to learn to fly.
So what were you learning at the airport?
Well, they didn't ration gas in the war for airplanes or boats, believe it or not. And the reason they had rationing in the first place was because of tires, the rubber. It wasn't the fuel, but you could get all the gas you wanted for a private airplane. And I learned in a Luscombe Silvair. Well, I remember it was, well, I was pretty excited, I guess, you know, being a young fellow of 18 years old. And I just wanted to learn to fly, I guess, as long as I can remember.
Do you remember your flight instructor's name?
No. Good Lord, no. I'd have to look in my logbooks. Well, I think the first experience I think that I can remember is airplanes have a lot of torque on takeoff, and all of a sudden you find yourself doing a 90-degree turn halfway down the runway, you know. So that was probably my first recollection of, uh-oh, you know. Yeah.
We all know the phrase, it's better to be down here wishing you were up there than being up there wishing you were down here.
Yes.
What was the first time you had that, ooh?
Oh, well, I don't know. Oh, yes, I do remember. I had an Apache. This was a 1954 Apache, number 13 built. And I had some friends in the back, and somebody sitting next to me, of course. And all of a sudden, I heard this lady in the back, sitting in the back seat, say, "Is there supposed to be oil all over the wing, John?" And so what had happened, one of the air-equipped hoses had broken, and it squirted all over the wing. So I was on one, and fortunately I was pretty near Katama Airport at the time, so I was able to get in without wrecking the engine. And then I spent 2 days cleaning it up, as I remember. The oil was every place. Oh, I had closer calls than that, let's put it that way. Probably the closest call I ever had was, I was flying, my wife and I and another friend were flying to Baja, California, and we'd taken off from Dutchess County Airport, and this was wintertime, and I was somewhere around Richmond, Virginia, for some reason, and all of a sudden, bang, I got hit by lightning. And when I got hit by lightning, it fried the battery to such an extent that they shorted out, and that shorted out my radios. So the last thing I heard from the ground was, would you squawk a particular code? Well, I couldn't respond because my stuff wasn't working. And I was on solid instruments to start with, and somewhere near Richmond, Virginia. So I said, I'm in trouble, to myself, to my dog, my wife, and so forth. So I made a turn to head for the ocean, and I started letting down, and this was in pretty high traffic area, so I really had to keep a sharp lookout. And I broke out over the water at about 800 feet near Salisbury, Maryland. And I found a little airport, and I was able to put the gear down manually, and that was a pretty exciting time. Because I didn't have really, all the instruments I had were the vacuum instruments. So it was steam gauges all the way. But that was a nasty thing, definitely. Other than that, and all the time I've been flying, I've really not had no serious problems. Little things, sure, like everybody has, but need a new tire. I had a tire blow out on me in Sweden when I landed, and fortunately, they had a tire at the airport, so I was in luck.
What are the odds of that?
Pretty slim, pretty slim.
So, you flew in Sweden. What would you say are the biggest differences in flying in Europe?
I think it's much easier to fly instruments, for instance, in Europe. And really, that's, if you're going to go someplace, that's really the way to go, is buy instruments, whether it's nice weather or not. The nice thing about it is you give them your flight plan. I mean, you tell them where you want to go and so forth. And you go away for a couple of days, you come back, and you tell them that you're there, and they just get in your airplane. You get in your airplane, and they clear you right away, immediately. Here you might be waiting out on the runway for a clearance. You don't have that problem in Europe at all.
Is that because of the volume of activity?
I think it is, yeah. The volume of traffic, yeah. There's very little private aviation in Europe, really. As a matter of fact, you go over there with an airplane, and all kinds of people are asking you out to their house for dinner and things like that. So it can be very pleasant. And we had a good time there.
Who were some of the more notable people you've given rides to? You talked about being friends with James Cagney.
The guy that got me into flying to start with and interested in airplanes to start with was a man named John Miller. And his father and my father were very close friends. And Miller became quite famous as the first guy to loop an order gyro, and he flew the Mail during the 20s and 30s, and he knew Lindbergh. He was there when Lindbergh took off from Long Island to go to Europe. He was quite a guy, and he flew a helicopter too, and he used to come over to the house and land on the lawn and take me for a ride, you know, that sort of thing. He's a good friend. He said, John, you really ought to have an airplane if you're going to go to Martha's Vineyard, you know. So he took me out here in his Bonanza. See, he said it only took 40 minutes, 45 minutes to fly down here. And I said, yeah, but you're flying over water. Isn't you scared of it? He said, no, I'm not scared of flying over water. My airplane's in good shape. I said, I think I'd like a twin. And he didn't like twins. He said, you got twice as many chances for an engine failure. That was his mantra. But anyway, I did get a twin, and he allowed us. It was pretty good. And he did take a couple of rides with me. But he's a nice guy. His father was president of De La Valle Separator Company. He died about 3 or 4 years ago, and he was over 100, I think, or certainly in his late 90s. I know he was flying an airplane. He had a Bonanza, and he had a Baron, and he was still flying both of them when he was in his 90s. Quite a guy. And when he died, in the airplane magazines, it was noted that he had passed away. Johnny Miller, his name was. I took off from Dutchess County Airport for a long time, and then I moved to Sky Acres Airport, which was it was very much like Katama Airport. It was a lot of guys who built their own airplanes and guys who were airline pilots who flew privately as well. It's a very interesting bunch of people, and they had an excellent restaurant there, and they have an excellent restaurant there, and so it was kind of fun to hang out there. All of them pretty much were rascals, I'd say. Guys were actually building airplanes commercially there. They'd build a kit and sell it. I got very interested in kit planes, and I've flown several of them, and a couple of them are really very interesting. One's called the Europa, which looks like a little flying egg, and it was a marvelous little airplane. And the guys who were building it had been hooked up with Grumman at one point in their lives. So these airplanes were sort of Grummanish, let's put it that way. Well built, tough little thing. There was an English airplane, that was the Europa, that's right. That was a two-place, it later became a four-place, and now is a certified airplane in this country, the Europa. Nifty little airplane. Had a single landing, main gear was just one wheel under the center of the fuselage, and had little roller skate wheels at the end of the wings. And the wheel was a big wheel, which retracted. And you could land that thing any place because the wheel was so big that, a woodchuck hole wouldn't be troubled by it too much. Yeah, Sun and Fun, right, exactly. And that's where I met this guy, and I got to know him pretty well. And I damn near bought a kit, actually. But the most interesting kit, I think, is this Zenith 701, and I saw one at the Katama Airport one day. It's rather small, but it takes off in 90 feet, lands in 90 feet, and cruises at 100. I mean, if you want to just go up and fly, you can land that bloody thing any place. That Storch is an interesting airplane. Australian guy that designed it, yeah. Well, that's an interesting airplane too. My interest at this point in my life is this. I can fly, because I have a valid driver's license, I can fly this type of airplane. And I'm really seriously thinking about a Storch or a Zenith myself, actually. The Storch is more complicated, though.
Have you been in a Storch?
Yes, I have. At Sun and Fun. The Germans built during World War II, and it was famous for a couple of specific things. They rescued Mussolini off a mountaintop or something in Italy at some point when he was in trouble. And it was a well-known airplane during World War II. Very, very high-lift situation and able to land and take off in short distances. And that interests me more than high speed. Because once you get up in the air, you're making a straight line for something and you're moving along at 100 knots. You don't need 200 miles an hour typically at all, or 300. If you have 150, that's plenty. If I'm going to go across the ocean, that's something else. Then you want gas and lots of engines. Well, I was always careful about icing, but I did run into it a few times when I didn't have boots. And on the Navajo I had boots, so it didn't bother me that much. But when I was flying across the ocean from Iceland to Scotland, I ran into ice. But as I said, I've always been very careful about it. So I always put this spray stuff on my propellers, because that's the worst thing to have is propeller ice, and it kept the ice off the propellers. But I picked up quite a bit of ice, and I was very glad to see the Isle of Lewis show up in front of me. And I was going up, and then I was going down trying to dump the ice that I'd collected. And I was finally, it flew off, and I was okay. But it was not a place to ice up over the ocean.
What's the most amount of ice that you remember seeing on your plane in flight?
An inch. I've seen it so much that you had to use the storm window to fly, and that was in the Navajo. It comes on very fast. Sometimes, sometimes when you come down through a cloud, and the temperature is just perfect, and it'll pick up ice so fast you just simply can't believe it. And it's not something that I would ever knowingly fly into, even if I did have boots, frankly. It's nasty stuff. You're not supposed to be there when it's like that, so I was always very careful about that. And I always had a storm scope in my airplane when they became available. And that is, you could sit on Martha's Vineyard and you could see what was happening between Martha's Vineyard, let's say, and Dutchess County Airport from the ground. And you could see your thunderheads and so forth, and you could dodge them that way, but I didn't fly into those circumstances ever, anyway. I've been through a thunderstorm a few times, and I don't like it. I don't like it.
The phrase, there are old pilots, there are bold pilots.
There are no
very few old, bold pilots.
There are very few, I think that's true. And you can see that. I mean, when you see and hear about some guy who gets himself killed, it's usually because he really is a stupidly bold guy. And we've all seen it. If you hang around an airport, you'll see this happen once in a while. I've known quite a few guys in my lifetime that have crashed, but I was never really surprised when these guys would crash.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Their names aren't important. What were the circumstances or events?
Well, I can tell you about all of them, I think.
Well, let's go.
One that sticks out in my mind particularly is a guy that I spent a lot of time with, a real good friend of mine, and he lived near Poughkeepsie, New York, and he had a Mooney, and he was always making an instrument approach off the Omni, and he'd always bust minimums, and he got to be known as kind of the Duke of Dutchess, they used to call him, because he'd always get in, sometimes when there was only 50 feet or something of a ceiling, and he'd come in, and finally he was with another guy, and he just come up from Florida, and he was making an approach off the Omni, and he got his altitude screwed up. He didn't set his altimeter properly, and when he came off the Omni, as he was coming into the final part of his flight, his altitude said something to him on the altimeter that was incorrect, and he was a very good pilot mechanically. I mean, he really knew how to do things, but he screwed up. He should have reset his altimeter when he was over the Omni before he made his procedure turns, and he didn't do it, or he did something wrong because he went into the ground. He was letting down.
Why don't all planes have the STOL kits?
I'd like to know the reason. Well, I think most people think that, well, you put that kit on your airplane, whether it's a Robertson or whether it's a Horton or whatever it might be, that it's going to slow the airplane up. That seems to be the principal reason. They don't want to give up any speed, and I think that's a big mistake, because what becomes most important, of course, is safety. And all you have to do is ask somebody who's tried an STOL airplane out, and then you'll find that he isn't going to go back to the kind of airplane that'll stall out on him on a steep turn or something. Some of the STOL stuff isn't that great, though. The French airplane, the Raleigh, has a leading edge that comes shooting out when an airplane reaches a certain speed. And that airplane is not anywhere near as good as a Cherokee with a Horton on it. Now, I've taken a Cherokee up next to a Helio. Which way do you fly? You fly backwards right along with them, you know. They simply can't believe it. And a Helio took off out of a tennis court. That was the first flight. Pretty good. As soon as I found out about STOL, I went for it. And see, the first plane I had, the first it was a Cherokee. And I put a Horton on that way back when, along with a constant speed prop. And then I remember I sold that and bought an Aero, and I was going to do the same thing with the Aero. And I figured, well, the Horton is a cheap kit. I'll put a Robertson on it. Well, the Robertson wasn't 1, 2, 3 next to the Horton. And I didn't really gain much from that particular experience. However, I put it on a twin Comanche, and it was terrific. Wonderful. I lost no speed at all. Well, vortex generators are something that's fairly recent, and it really makes a difference in a twin, because you don't have to worry so much about torque on takeoff, and if you lose an engine, you're okay. You're better off than you would be if you didn't have these on the airplane. However, they're all glued on, as you well know, and they fly off too. I mean, you got to replace them as they fly off.
We are all familiar with checking the winds at various altitudes.
Yeah.
I've heard stories of people being able to make remarkable time flying at the right altitudes at the
Sure.
right time.
I remember I was flying from Prestwick, Scotland to Biggin Hill, which is near London, and I had a tailwind probably of 50 or 60 or 70 miles an hour, something unbelievable, and I made that trip. We should have taken 2 hours. I made it in about an hour. It was amazing. I remember that particularly. And also when you have a headwind sometimes, you remember that too, you know. Then you think about gasoline. Yeah, no question.
Have you ever flown backwards?
Sure. In the Cherokee.
Describe that experience.
Well, you put it right up into an attitude that is just so precipitous feeling, and you have a good headwind, and you'll go backwards. Well, that's a trick that everybody, you got to try it out when you have a STOL kit on there. Well, you did that. You said you tried it out. It wouldn't stall. I know the instructors back at Sky Acres, they wouldn't teach in the Cherokee because it didn't stall. And so my kids, when they learned to fly, they had to go into another airplane. You'll find after a while that you get pretty good at it. And the tower always is amazed. Oh, what the heck are you flying? Good Lord, you know. You're turning off where airplanes are turning on, and they can't believe it, you know. I don't want to be scared to death like you can in any Beechcraft. Gosh, I hate those airplanes. Because you can get killed on a beach in a Bonanza or a Baron. I had a Travel Air, and let me tell you, they want to go upside down if you get them slow. I realized that the Bonanza was designed in the 40s. You know, that butterfly tail is something that Beech finally gave up. And then finally when somebody came up with a mod for it, you know, they wouldn't admit that there was anything wrong with their airplanes, but they put that mod on their airplanes that they sold. And they later gave up on V-tails altogether and went to a standard tail. Well, the first one was a Debonair. And I had a Beech, and I'll tell you, they were fast, but that was it. They were dangerous, I think. That's why I always liked Piper, because you never had a problem with loading a Piper, whereas with a Beech, you could get an AFCG so fast and really get in trouble. I had an AFCG close to an accident as a result of it once. But anyway, I had an airplane that they installed that in, and they put it way back in the tail, and I had an AFCG problem, and I came into a landing, and the airplane was so erratic that I was very fortunate to get it on the ground without hurting myself. I had to fly it on the ground, rather. I mean, I really had to keep it going and use up almost all the runway, too, and brakes. But AFCG is a very, very bad thing. Very bad. Piper they're built with really a forward problem more than a rearward problem. So you can load the hell out of a Piper, but you can't Beech. I don't know much about Cessnas because I never spent any time in them. Well, I've flown all of them, I think, but from 152s up, but right through the hottest of them. But I never owned one.
Why not?
Well, I started out with a Piper to start with, and I just liked them so much that I stuck with it. Out of ignorance, or the continuity of ignorance, or something. You know. I had a Beech at one point in time, and that was a sad story, I thought. I had a French airplane called a Raleigh, which was very disappointing. I would not recommend that to anybody. But I don't consider it to be an STOL airplane at all. And it has a sliding canopy, and so if you go over on your back, you're not going to get out of the airplane, which I don't like. And I had it tip up once in a big breeze at Katama. Steve called me up and said, "You better get your airplane inside." At that point I had the Raleigh. He says, "Come on over." So I got in the airplane and was taxiing towards the hangar where he offered me space, and this big wind came along and lifted up the tail, and I hit the prop on the ground, and fortunately I didn't go all the way over, but it was pretty close. I should have left it on the tie down. Anyway, it isn't a 1, 2, 3 next to a Cherokee in terms of speed, in terms of short distance landing in any fashion at all. It's a pretty airplane, but very complicated airplane too. Have you ever seen one? Here's some of them right here. I've been flying since 1943. That's a long time. So there's some of them right there, see? Right there, airplanes. And they're not all there either. Aerostar, I had one of those.
Tell me about the Aerostar.
Don't open the door. The prop is 1 inch from your nose. You really don't want to play with that one. Very fast. Very crowded. It's a 6-place airplane, but tiny seats. There's the beach. You saw that one. That's a beach right there. And the Raleigh is in there someplace.
How long did you have the Aerostar?
Very short time. I made a couple of long trips, and I didn't like the airplane. You couldn't put an STOL on it either. They didn't have anything available. But it was fast. Fast. The same guy that designed the Aero Commander. Aerostar was designed, you know, first of all, to be a jet. And the idea was, first they put recips on it, and then when the jet engines, smaller jet engines became available, they were going to put them on the Aerostar. Because it was designed really to be a very fast airplane, and it was designed to carry a jet engines rather. And Ted Smith, his name was. I bought a 601. No, that's an Aero Commander that Hoover flew. He's a very good friend of John Miller's, by the way, and I flew with him once.
Tell me about that.
Well, he and John Miller were great friends, and there was going to be some activity. He had a P-51, this guy, a yellow one, and it was a 2-place, and he came to Dutchess County to see John Miller about going to Rhode Island to some event, and I found myself in the air with him, giving me a ride. Very nice guy. He was a great buddy of Miller's, this guy I talked about before, Johnny Miller. And Johnny Miller, there was this organization, I think guys over 90 that are flying or something. And he's actually, I remember John Miller telling me about some guy who was over 100 that was still flying. Unbelievable. He used to go to these meetings of these old guys. John Miller did. I don't know what it's called, but some organization for older people.
Familiar with the QBs?
Sure. Queer birds. They're primarily drunks. As far as I know, anyway. They are. They like to party. Tom Burke, he was a CB and QB rather, and he was an interesting guy. He flew. He had a Cessna 310. He was one of my buddies, and Joe Yowell, all those guys. They were all Katama nuts. Joe had an Aero Commander. I flew with him lots. He smoked a pipe, and he'd on takeoff he'd put the pipe down on the floor, take off, and as soon as he got airborne, he'd put the pipe back in his mouth. Quite a guy. he was working with Goodyear on boots, and they put boots on the Twin Navion, on the Apache rather, and he flew the Apache through the tests where they set the airplane up and they squirt water on it, and the ice builds up and they'd see if it works or not. That was Joey Owl. He was quite a guy. He had a Twin Navion early on, and he ended up in the bushes with that one. That had a Lycoming 170 horsepower. That 170 was critical in terms of how it shook, and they'd fail. The prop would fail on it. The prop would come right off the airplane because of this harmonic or something. And that's what happened to him. He was in Virginia or something, and all of a sudden, prop came off, and he had to land pretty fast. That Lycoming 170, you just did not want to get near that one. They have the 150, they have a 160, they had a 170, don't bother with that. And then they had the 180, which is a marvelous airplane. The 160 is probably the best engine that Lycoming makes. On the Twin Comanche, I've seen them with 3,500 hours on them, still going. I had a Twin Comanche, the last one I had, I put a 200 horsepower Lycoming on it. They were meant to have 160s, and I put this outfit called Miller, and I put all their options on the Twin Comanche, plus a Robertson STOL, and it was an unbelievable airplane. It was absolutely the best thing that I'd ever been in. And that's it right there, the blue and white one. And that was taking a big hill. I got out of the airplane. I had to cross the ocean when I was 59 because they wouldn't insure you if you were 60. I don't know why, but...
Would you say that was the best airplane you ever had?
Yes. No, or the Cherokee. That Cherokee is just a fabulous airplane.
Really?
I don't think I'd want to go to California and it'd take too long, so to speak, but for the kind of flying that people typically do, you go from home to Martha's Vineyard or something like that, or occasionally you go to Florida, it's great.
Well, I want to go to New Jersey. I
No
grew up
problem.
in New Jersey, go around Newark, go inland.
In a hot airplane, you'd be there in an hour, and in the Cherokee, you'll be there in an hour and 20 minutes. So what the hell is 20 minutes? Put a nice autopilot in it, and an alarm clock, and go to sleep. But I know guys that have done it. Quentin Berg, he had a company called Berg Electronics. Very well-known guy. They made connectors and so forth, and he's been flying since airplanes were invented, I think. He had the autopilot in it, and he'd go to sleep. Set the alarm clock for, when he could come into the next Omni, and, it was crazy. Quentin Berg became national champion in gliders. He became famous in World War II, designing quick docks and things like that for when they made the amphibious landings. He designed several things that were quite well known. Again, it was a case of my family knowing the mother of Quentin, and who turned out, she married a friend of my father's, and so we knew him pretty well. But he was really into gliders, this guy. I'm telling you. You got some guys who really like flying gliders. I've done it, and I'm not interested in gliders. You can't really go any place, and you just want to fly around the field. Fly around mountain, no way. Bad enough in a propeller airplane, I don't want to be in a glider.